Welcome to the Philadelphia Cultural Forum on CCP TV, Community College of Philadelphia's Emmy-nominated educational channel. I'm your host, Kirsten Quinn, and I am incredibly excited about our guests on tonight's episode. Dr. Marcia Ferguson is a full-time faculty member in the Theater Arts program at Penn, which she directed from 2013 to 2016. She has published 2 books on theater, as well as essays and criticism in many prestigious publications. Equally passionate about acting, directing, scholarship, and theater pedagogy, while studying for an MFA in acting and a PhD in theater. She has taught at Swarthmore College and Temple University in campuses in Tokyo, Philadelphia, and Rome. She's directed over 15 productions, including 3 at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and 2 at the Philadelphia Fringe Festival, at times co-creating and performing as well as directing. She has acted in independent films, commercials, and in live productions, including at the Wilma Theater, and was nominated for a Barrymore Award for Best Supporting Actress for her performance as Lady Anne in Edward Bond's restoration. She is certified in neutral mask training, has studied voice and movement with Meredith Monk, devising and improvisation with Pig Iron Theater, and Commedia dell'arte with Antonia Fava. Sebastian Mundheim is an interdisciplinary performance maker, installation artist, educator, and founder and artistic director of White Box Theater. Her artwork integrates visual installation, puppetry, storytelling, dance, and theater. She develops story and physical movement in tandem, writing and building together, finally collaborating with performers to animate visual, lyrical, and literary worlds. Mundheim has been creating work for over 25 years. She's been an artist in residence in many universities and museums and created numerous original interdisciplinary performances, performed nationally and internationally. Works have been commissioned and/or presented at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Rosenbach Museum and Library, the Kimmel Center for the Performing Arts, Lantern Theater Company, the Art and Theater, Masmoka, and the Irish Ministry of Arts and Culture, just to name a few. She has received many awards and fellowships, including 2 Barrymore Awards in 2014. White Box Theater accepts commissions for new work, tours existing work, offers residencies, lectures, workshops, and provides consulting in interdisciplinary program design. Please welcome Marcia Ferguson and Sebastian Mundheim to the show. Such amazing biographies. I wanted to give a longer bio intro for you guys so that we could talk about some of the many things that you have before we get into one of the works that we're going to be looking at today that you've collaborated on. And so I wanted to find out first a little bit about you as artists and how you started out, what propelled you into this world, and what your origins in theater and production and design are. So,
do you want to go first, Sebastian?
No, I think you should go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Gosh, my origins. Well, okay, my claim to fame as a kid was that I was asked to audition for Linda Blair's role in The Exorcist.
Wow.
No. But my mother would not let me.
Can you show us what you did?
Yeah, I didn't. I didn't actually. I never even found out about it until I was much later. So that'll give you some sense. I was in as a 10-year-old. I was in my first movie, so I kind of enjoyed that. I found out that I really enjoyed performing, and looked for opportunities every chance I could, and did a lot of acting at Bryn Mawr College in student theater, which gave me such a taste for it that I decided I needed some training, some classical training, and I wound up getting an MFA in theater and acting at Temple, which was a wonderful experience. I studied with great people there, and that's when I was working with Blanca and Yiri in the early days at the Wilma, and I did some shows with them and learned so much from working there, and started doing a little bit of film and some independent projects, and wound up finding out that I also love teaching. So went and got a PhD in theater at CUNY in New York, and that landed me at Penn, where I've been, and Swarthmore and Penn. So I've been teaching quite a long time as well, and I found that teaching and process and product are a very nice match for me.
Yeah, they are for me too. It's interesting because when I was talking to you a little bit earlier about it, we have very similar stories.
Yes, we do.
In terms of how we got into things, so that's kind of cool.
We understand each other.
We do.
Were there specific things? I mean, because I know a little bit about this, but I don't know all about your history. Were there specific things?
Who are you?
But I mean, were there specific things in your really early career that you were attracted to as a performer and a director?
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, I really loved working in sort of an alternative mode on more experimental pieces. So, for example, I worked, the nomination, the Barry Nor, which I'd totally forgotten about, but that was with a director named Paul Berman, and it was for the role of Lady Anne in Restoration, Edward Bond's play, and he was so, as a director, he used so many different approaches to performing. I remember doing hieroglyphics and all kinds of improvisatory techniques. And that really rang my chimes. I just loved working that way. And I learned so much from Blanca. I remember I did The Hairy Ape very early on. And she had this wonderful concept for the Fifth Avenue scenes where we were all of a sudden encased in cardboard, and we had to learn to move very differently. It's actually reminiscent of some of what I've really admired about watching Sebastian in the process of the Eumenides, working with materials. And you know, in that case, it was cardboard.
Which is interesting because you always were saying to me, maybe we should do this in a Russian constructivist style.
That's right. I have such a crush on
cardboard.
Yes, constructivism.
It could.
Yeah. Someday.
That's interesting. I've always found like avant-garde work and work that's got that more sort of interdisciplinary or devised approach to be really alluring and interesting, and I don't know, it's really exciting because you really do feel like you're learning something that's completely out there and unique, and that I will not have this experience anywhere else.
Yes.
You know, as opposed to doing a more traditional approach to a project. So how about you, Sebastian? Tell us a little bit about your beginnings.
I will, but I also wanted to say, I mean, one of the things about work that's interdisciplinary, or, I mean, less so just devised, but I think really interdisciplinary work challenges our sense of time and kind of our core vocabulary and reality in a really different way, which I think is important because we just kind of assume that the narrative world should be the dominant one, and we
Who's
might
to
not
say
be
that?
right. You know. So anyway, that's said from the visual artist perspective. So, like you, I started making things, was kind of involved in the arts from a young age. I always made these kind of sculptural characters, and I mean, since I was a really little kid, I had like 85 of them I kept under my bed, and I had, I did, and I had cool. Like my mom would, you know, tuck me in or whatever, and I would turn the light on under my bed and get under and like play with these little worlds under my bed from when I was really small. And when I was a teenager, I used to make these kind of sculptural characters. They were often spoofs on, you know, my parents and their friends, sort of like that, the world that they lived in. But they were fantastical. Spoof is maybe the wrong word, sort of fantastical. And I put them in different environments and photographed them. I learned how to do photography. I had an independent study in high school where we had to go and work with somebody, you know, to mentor us in a profession. And I worked with this landscape architect for 2 days, and she taught me how to use her macro lens to take pictures. And I went back to my school and I said, you know, could I mentor myself?
Yeah.
So, you know, I decided that I would study with myself. And I said, I'd much rather take pictures of my things than somebody else's things, which was unusual for that program, but they let me do it. And I photographed all these little characters in different environments, and I wrote a 20-page script, and I read the script into a microphone, and I had these boom boxes, and I would, you know, like turn up the music and read something, and then turn down the music, and so I made this slideshow with a cassette tape that I would force people to watch it.
I'm sure they wanted to see it, actually.
I still think
It's really entertaining. I want to see it.
And I
want to see it right now.
Me too.
And developing the slides was also really, I mean, it was a big commitment, because developing slides, it wasn't like your iPhone. It was, I think I spent $400 making that, which was, you know, as a 16-year-old in 1983, it was, you know, it was a lot of money to me anyway. So anyway, so that was, I think that was kind of like the beginning of making interdisciplinary stories. I studied painting at Penn, kind of by accident. I didn't like making art alone in a studio. I got a chance to teach. Someone asked me if I wanted to come teach kids in New Orleans, and I thought, well, I'm not sure I like art. I'm pretty sure I don't like kids. But I'll go to New Orleans. And so I went to New Orleans, and it was actually, it was really a fantastic experience, because I could make every step of the process of making something actually conceptual. Yeah. I would take a conceptual idea, and every aspect of the process was concrete, because I had to explain it to kids. I had to learn how to make things in a, so the first thing I made with them was I made this, I wanted to make this giant banquet table at Penn with these larger-than-life kind of sculptural characters, and the Penn professor said to me, sorry, sometimes they're difficult, those Penn professors. He said to me, you can't build these chairs if you don't know the history of a chair, if you don't know the physics of a chair. You know, maybe you can design one chair on a piece of paper. And then I went down to teach kids in New Orleans, and I told the artistic director of the program that I was going to work that way, and she said, great. And so I went to a bar in New Orleans, and I met a carpenter, and I said, can you help me build 15 chairs by Monday? Right. And we did. Which just goes to show you that you don't need to know the physics of the chair and the history of the chair, blah, blah, blah. Right. You know, you just get on it. So anyway, I started to pitch these interdisciplinary projects with kids to different art centers in Philadelphia, and it was really satisfying, because I could take a concept, think about how to make discrete steps of discovery in order to develop the concept, and build it with a group of people. And I thought, this is so much better than being alone in a studio. And those installations naturally provoked story. And then I sort of got interested in how kids told stories. So that was the beginning. And then the Arthur Ross Gallery at Penn, I think it was like 94, said to me, well, you're an arts educator. Will you do some museum education for us? And I thought, like, God, I don't want to stand up in front of a bunch of people and bore them to death the way I felt when I was a kid and would go to museums and listen to docents. Right. So I was super worried, as I always am, and I labored over a script, and then I thought, like, what if nobody listens to this? You know, a story about Saul Steinberg, who the first exhibition was about. So I labored over this script, and then I thought, what if they don't understand that word? Well, maybe I should hold up a prop so that they understand that that's what that word means, because these were kids. And then I thought, well, maybe they need to interact with movement. And so I started to do this storytelling that was somewhat illustrated. And then the big turning point for me was Rosenbach. The Rosenbach Museum and Library said to me, well, you're an artist educator and you do these bookbinding projects with kids. Could you do a bookbinding project? And I said, well, no, I'm doing performance now, because I had done a 5-minute storytelling piece at Penn. And so they said, okay, well, we do a lot of things for kids. I mean, we have some things that work for kids. We have Lewis Carroll, we have Maurice Sendak. And I said, well, don't you have Ulysses? Because I tried to read Ulysses in college? And they said, well, we do, but it's not exactly for kids. And I said, but it has water in it, right? Kids like water. I had no idea what I was talking about. But it was kind of great. Then I had this challenge. I had to really read James Joyce's Ulysses, and I had to break it down so it would make sense for kids. And I started to think,
quite a feat.
well, I mean, but I looked at the parallel between the original myth and how Joyce interpreted it, and I took little pieces of Joyce's language, and my neighbor was an actor, and another person I knew was a saxophone player, and I said, well, I'll make this more interesting by incorporating these things. And the visual objects that I made to do the storytelling were very similar to the prototypes I was making to teach kids how to make things, objects. So basically, that's where it all started. And I started to do these. I got more and more commissions from museums to do something based in their collections. And I would spend all the research money. Like the PMA, Philadelphia Museum of Art, said, well, we've got an exhibition on Giorgio de Chirico and the myth of Ariadne. Will you make an education program for us? And I said, sure. I had $5,000 or $6,000 from them. So I ended up wrangling 4 dancers, 2 puppeteers, 2 musicians, and me. And I wrote a 45-minute performance that we did 10 times, plus we did a hands-on, I did the whole thing for $5,000. Like, we were rehearsing in a freezing cold warehouse, and anyway, so that was kind of, and then Paula Marincola and Melissa Franklin from the Pew Foundation were sitting in the audience. I didn't know who they were, and they came up to me and they said, you should be applying for funding for this work because you're a performance artist. And I was like, what's a performance artist? I'm just trying to teach this stuff. So it really, and then I started to get more and more, I didn't really know anything about dance or theater, but I got more interested in those art forms as methods of storytelling, and then got interested in them for what they did intrinsically. And so that's kind of, so my work has always integrated a group of people building stuff, the metaphor that's inherent in materials, sometimes because it's literally there or it's the quality of the material. And then kind of I got really interested in how performers interact with objects and how that works in storytelling. And I had a long background as a martial artist, which kind of informed the relationship between breath and movement. And so that's I don't know where I was in my story, but that's a long story.
No, it's a great story.
But I'm old, so I can tell one.
You are not. So how did the two of you guys link up? How did that happen?
Well, I had some funding for an artistic resident when I was directing the theater arts program, and I was looking for someone to collaborate with me specifically on a production of Aeschylus's The Eumenides, which is a play I'd wanted to direct ever since I first encountered it in graduate school. And I had always admired Sebastian's work intensely. We'd never met, but I'd followed her. And we'd actually had a funny connection over the phone when she was at Penn working a lot with the Arthur Rusk Gallery. I was teaching a course and I had reserved some kabuki materials at the museum, and at the library, and she wanted to borrow them. And so she called and we had this short conversation, but she was so nice. I thought, that's an interesting person, and she sounds so friendly, and she's doing such interesting things. Anyway, that's how it came about. I reached out, and then we had a meeting at my house, and I presented the project, and I came away thinking she was not interested in it. I was thinking, boy, she's asking a lot of questions. I'm not sure she's interested in doing this play. I hope so, but I'm not sure. I had to convince her. I had to talk her into it.
It's so funny because we were talking about this before this taping, but I remember the whole thing so differently. But that's what
Rashomon. What's your version? Go ahead.
Yes, exactly.
Well, because I remember Marcia saying, well, what kinds of things are you interested in? And I said, well, I'm interested in feminism, I'm interested in economics, I'm interested in justice. She said, well, are there this is my memory, this is obviously not true, because I'm sure you're right. and I, or maybe you, or maybe you.
I'm sure I did ask you
and
those
I know,
things.
well, because I know also Marcia is an incredibly enjoyable and gracious person to work with. So I'm sure that you actually
Thank you.
worked into this in a way that was
maybe I was just like
tricking you. It was my idea. But she said, you know, what kinds of things are you interested in? I listed these things in my memory. And she said, well, let me think about a play that might fit those needs.
Wow.
So maybe there was a little piece of that.
Maybe
and
I
then
was
came back and said,
being sly.
I've thought about a number of things. How
does
about the
have all those
humanities?
It does have all those things.
It does.
That's how I remember it. And then, and I remember thinking like, oh my God, one of these Greek plays. Like, can we do something more interesting? And then I tried to read it, and it was like, because
really?
I'm just not that sophisticated. So, you know.
Well, we don't all walk around reading Greek plays all the time.
But actually reading plays is really difficult because they're so abstract. You know, I mean, for me anyway, I think that reading a play is not, it's not like reading a novel. It doesn't, and especially as a visual person, it doesn't have, there's a lot that's missing, that which is what the interpreters put into place. So, and I also, part of my process as a maker is to ferociously doubt whatever's put in front of me. But Marcia didn't know
really
that.
useful.
So she thought I didn't like the material, but actually
she was just doubting it, which is actually a strengthening exercise. It forced me to articulate things.
I have to fall in love with my kidnapper, and so I have to make somebody kidnap me first, then fall in love.
Yes. So the whole Stockholm syndrome thing happening.
It's a little scary, but that's okay. No, I wanted to respond to something you said about reading a play, because I think that's so important. And when you're reading a play because it's been given to you, is like, here's something that I want you to collaborate on. And that's very different from reading a play when you are, the way I first encountered the humanities, as part of this trilogy, as part of a very in-depth study of Aeschylus and Greek tragedy in general, and as part of a PhD program, and it's like this whole intellectual legacy that goes behind an historical orientation. Right. So I fell in love with the play on those terms, but also artistically, also as an artist, because I've just responded to it in that way, like, I want to get this on its feet, I want to do it, I want to make it. But I think that's very different. So there's different ways of reading plays.
Well, and what's interesting, I mean, I was thinking about it because I have done so much work that's commission-based, and a lot of times the content is pretty obscure, and, you know, you're walking around in your life having the themes that preoccupy you intellectually, and your daily routines and materials that interest you, and suddenly somebody comes out of left field with something that is important to them, you know, and you don't really have any investment. And I know that I'm not going to, until I figure out how it's connected to what I can't do something because I've been asked to do it. I have to do something because I'm in love with it. And so the process of falling in love is sometimes also like really pushing to find, like, you might have, you may have loved that piece for so long that it was sort of obvious, but I had to push to find the place of passion and like fight it a little bit, and, you know, just figure out how it connected to what I was passionate about until we landed on that before we could just go, because I wasn't going to just do a design because I was asked to do a design.
Right. Which is why you're worth working with. Because, I mean, you're not a journeyman, you know, you're not there to sort of plug a hole. You're there for the passion.
So the first thing I'd like for us to do is to talk a little bit about the story of the Eumenides, and so Marcia, we'll start with you, and then maybe Sebastian, you can sort of merge your version into it. Does that sound good? Okay, great.
So it's the third play in a trilogy by Aeschylus, and which deals with Agamemnon's homecoming and his murder by Clytemnestra, and the revenge for that murder taken by Orestes, their son, who then in turn murders Clytemnestra in the Libation Bearers. So we have in the third play of the trilogy the whole question of guilt, of vengeance, and sort of it's really a very long denouement to all the action that's happened previously in the previous two plays. So it opens with Clytemnestra in the underworld, sort of scolding the Furies because they've fallen asleep in their task of pursuing Orestes around the world and making his life very miserable, because they are the gods that are charged with avenging matricides specifically. Familial blood, but matricides. And basically, it's about his rescue by Apollo, who takes his side, and it's a rare play in that there is movement from Delphi to Athens. And
it's usually just one scene, setting in Greek tragedy.
Precisely. So we have this division between the scene where Orestes has taken refuge in the Temple of Apollo, and the Furies are asleep, like literally around him, where they've chased him, and now they're waiting. You know, they've been waiting for him to make his next move, but instead he's pleading. So Apollo appears, says, "You have my patronage. I will protect you. Go to the temple of Athena and figure out the next step. You know, there you'll find judgment and you'll find the resolution to your predicament." So he does. He flies, and the Furies are aroused and awakened by Clytemnestra. They pursue him to the temple of Athena in Athens, and there Athena appears, and there's a resolution to the issue. There's a bit of a debate, actually. There's a legalistic
like a
moment,
trial.
Trial, and Athena eventually sides with Orestes and proclaims him innocent, but she throws a bone to the Furies and says, "Okay, you can sort of be patrons of Athens and help the crops grow and keep the women fertile and children coming." And but in our reading of it, I mean, there's a great loss for the Furies. These goddesses are put down. And sort of taken off of a pedestal that they thought they had under them. So
I like, it's so great to hear anybody retell a story, right? Because everybody, it just, you know, the play is however long it is, 55 minutes, and you just told it in 3 minutes. So, you know, you select the particular things that are interesting to you, right? And so, I mean, so when I tell it, it's a little bit different, which is cool. I mean, that's the whole, you know, back and forth. We had one actor say, "It's so interesting to have two people kind of telling me what to do, because you're telling me kind of,
I'm sure,
like opposite things,
but
also things
enriching.
that give me a much more three-dimensional sense of this character." So
it's adding layers. It's creating, you know, it's creating a structure as well as all of the internal guts of the thing.
So I want to tell what I always tell, like, my niece and nephew about the story. And think about the thematics a little bit differently. So again, being the person who doesn't have the background, I don't think I ever read the first two, you know, so I only have my own little, probably wrong version of the story. But I always say, so in the beginning, Agamemnon goes across the ocean to save his brother's wife, Helen, who's been held captive in Troy. Don't tell me if I'm wrong till the end, okay?
I'm not. Far be it from
and he's
me.
Sailing across the ocean, the ship dies, the winds die, and so and the gods say, well, Agamemnon, if you want to get to Troy, you're going to have to sacrifice your daughter, and then we'll put the winds back in your sail. So Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia, gets to Troy, and spends 10 years there fighting the battle, trying to regain Helen. Takes a concubine, Cassandra, and in the meantime, Clytemnestra is pretty happy ruling Argos on her own. She also has a lover, and he comes back, and Clytemnestra is not that happy to see him because he's killed their daughter. He has a concubine. He's been gone for 10 years, and she's frankly fine without him. So she says, you know, honey, you look tired. Why don't you go take a bath? And she kills him in the bathtub. And the gods, who have a little, you know, leaning towards the male hero, are super pissed off, and they decide, Apollo in particular decides he's going to punish Clytemnestra for killing the hero, her husband. So Apollo goes to their son, Orestes, and says, who I can only picture as Ryan Berlin, goes to their son Orestes and says, you must avenge your father, you must kill your mother. And Orestes is kind of tortured about this for a moment, but basically feels like he should avenge his father.
It takes a whole play for him to
see
screw up his courage to do it. I think it takes him a little longer than a moment. I'm just saying.
I think you're totally right. I mean, I'm sure you're totally right.
He didn't want to do it.
So
he didn't want to do it.
So he did. So and we've addressed that in the center chase scene. Okay. So Orestes, in a greatly tortured way, kills his mother in the second play, and in the third play, Clytemnestra comes up from the dead. It's been pretty awful down there because
she's not having any fun at all.
No, because Agamemnon is celebrated, and she's the jerk in Hades, and totally.
She's not very popular.
No, so she comes up from the dead, and you have to remember that Apollo and Athena are the new order of Greek gods, right? Before that, there was, how do you pronounce Melissa's favorite, the Tectonic?
I say it wrong. I say Chthonic, but that's probably wrong. There are, Greek pronunciations.
Yes.
I don't even try to do them right because I always do them wrong.
Some people say
Chthonic.
Ismene and Antigone and
Antigone, and there's all different.
So, however you pronounce it.
Anyway, we can say them any way we want. That's what I think.
The older world of gods.
The
older world of gods is more feminine, and in the older world of gods are the Furies, and the Furies revenge matricide, and so Clytemnestra says, okay, you old world gods, you think you don't have a function anymore because now we have Athena and Apollo and this whole group, but I want you to get up and do something about this because I've been wronged. And so the whole play is this kind of the relationship between the old world gods who say maybe the mother's voice should be heard, and the new world gods who say, as we hear, Apollo say so horribly, who cares about the mother? She's just the house. She just houses the seed.
She's not a parent. She's not the parent.
Right. She's just a house for the seed.
It's the stallion's thrust that is the parent.
And so that's what we're posed with in our contemporary time as we watch this play in 2016. And the other thing that's really interesting is, so the Furies begin to chase Orestes, and Orestes says, Apollo, you have to protect me. And Apollo says, I will. And they go through this whole chase scene. Apollo says, but what you really need to do is get to Athens, because in Athens, Athena will really make the judgment and really protect you. And what's happening in Athens at the time, and you can correct me again if I'm wrong,
I'm not going
is
to
that
anything you say.
that Athena,
Not my department.
Athena wants to have a more democratic, stable city. And so she says, well, I'm not going to make this decision by myself. We'll have the citizens make a decision. And this is kind of important because it's actually the beginning of the juried trial system.
Yep.
So,
Right.
so you have this juried trial.
12 citizens.
12 citizens are selected, all men, to make this decision. And in fact, the jury's hung. And so then Athena says, well,
Athena makes the, yeah.
I'll make the final
She
decision
casts
here.
the deciding vote.
And she says, well, I was born out of the head of a man, so I don't really have that much sympathy for the mother, so I vote for Orestes. And then, I mean, and this is, we had a little disagreement about this, but she says to the Furies, who go like mad over
Right.
this, she says to the Furies, now just calm down for a minute. You know, there's a place for you in this new society. You will be prayed to every day for the well-being of the crops, and so you'll be named every day. And the Furies have a little bit of an ego, so they say okay. But the other thing is that Athena also says, don't forget, I have the key to the house with the lightning bolts.
That's right.
So whether or not the
Threatens them.
Furies really, whether or not the Furies really say like, great, we'd love that role, or they're kind of bullied into it, they don't have
Yeah.
a choice, is up for grabs in the play. And I think Aeschylus probably thought they were just fine with that new role, and one of the things that we decided is that they probably weren't. And
Weren't
that
so
they're-
fine with it.
Right.
Yeah, but they weren't really given a choice. I mean, really, the only choice they have is to be nice and help protect the fertility of the crops and the women, or be really nasty, which is what they originally threatened to do, and burn everything up and kill all the crops and kill all the children and
Yeah.
and basically shut down the city.
That's, I mean, two very complete visions of the story being told, and how the way in which you guys riff off of one another just in this conversation, I can see that in the collaboration you had with the production. So now that we know the story of the Eumenides, I wanted to take a look at the videos so that they can see your interpretation and the magic that you create with that interpretation. So just give me a little bit of setup as to what we're going to be seeing, because it's sort of it's not the entire production. There are clips from the production. And just maybe tell me a little bit about, for the audience, what we'll be seeing in the clip.
Well, I would like to talk a little bit about the location, because I think that
Sure.
was a very important part of
yes,
our
definitely,
process.
definitely.
We were fortunate enough to be in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, University of Pennsylvania. So the Penn Museum was incredibly generous and allowed us access to 3 beautiful galleries, and we placed the play in 3 different locations. I mentioned before that the play actually changes locations from Delphi to Athens. So we created a 3rd location,
Neat.
which was kind of, in my mind, the centerpiece, the pinnacle of the action,
Okay.
which staged a moment that is not actually in the play, but it ironically is my favorite part of the play, which is the actual pursuit of Orestes by the Furies.
Right.
That image just excites me as a theater maker and as a reader. So I handed it over to Sebastian, and I asked her to take responsibility for that centerpiece, for that moment of pursuit,
Okay.
and to interpret that as she would. And so she did something quite amazing with it, which you will see. The other thing to note about it is that the acoustics are impossible.
Yeah.
beautiful.
And beautiful.
Beautiful at the same time.
So we invited in another collaborator, Patrick Lambourne, who's a wonderful local composer and composes a lot of music for theater and has worked in a lot of different contexts and in different productions. But for this production, he brought in a number of beautiful instruments. You'll hear a lot of singing bowls and percussion, and he created a soundscape, more or less,
Nice.
in collaboration with the movement and design elements shadow, color that Sebastian used to create this moment that is not technically in the text,
Right.
but it's in our production,
Yeah.
because we both felt it was important.
Yeah.
And then I dealt with the surrounding sections in Delphi and the discovery of Orestes in the Sleeping and the Sleeping Furies, Clytemnestra's call to action, and then the third part in Athens when Athena emerges from behind this wonderful statue of Ramses II. It's a pharaoh, which to my mind always seemed exceptionally judicial.
Yes.
So we associated her with that statue in particular, and she kind of revealed herself from behind it, and the rest of the trial played out in a playing space before that statue. So that was sort of the organizing focal point for the blocking and the unfolding of that part of the dramatic action.
Fantastic. Let's take a look.
She that is called the mother of the child is not its parent, but the nurse of the new seed. It is the stallion's thrust that is the parent.
This is such a beautiful production in every possible way, and the visual images that you guys create in this while telling this story of the play, to me, are just phenomenal. I mean, the spectacle of it is there, but there's also this sort of, we talked a little bit about the deepening of layers when you're working with more than one person in a collaboration. And to use the materials that you're using to tell this story, to use the music, to use the song and the way that the characters emerge in the space and the movement that you've created. There's so many layers to this. If we could just talk for a few minutes about materials and the visual side of things, as well as the way in which you directed it, and either of you can speak to this first or second, whichever, about those aspects.
I guess, I mean, one of the things I think that was really fortunate about the fact that we come from such different disciplines and had such a kind of rigorous, passionate conversation before we jumped in was Marcia spent, she was so, I mean, it was so exciting to watch the teaching of the language and the articulation. I mean, one of the things that struck me in the beginning, having not worked on plays really very much, I mean, I do storytelling, but I really don't work with plays. I've worked in dance. And watching Marcia really work with her students in articulating the language and really thinking about the meaning of every line, and watching that develop at, you know, in the table sessions, which is the, you know, the rehearsal process, without any performance, but just the performance of the words, and her care in that way was fantastic. And in a way, like, I had very specific metaphors that spoke to me, and Marcia was working with the tongues of the actors to get the articulation to be really specific, and I was twisting the paper like with the same kind of articulation in the studio, so that there was this real balance of discipline.
Yeah.
And I mean, in terms of talking about materials, I had been working I've really worked my whole career with paper in different ways, and part of it is because it's like a kid material, but it's also a material of incredible elegance and integrity and flexibility. And I had just finished doing the Jungle Book with the Pennsylvania Ballet, and I guess right before that I had found that if I twisted these paper towels that were covered in paint, I could weave them really quickly, because I mean, it doesn't really matter, except for that the saturation of color in that twisted paper was something I just totally fell in love with. And I did this really literal thing for the Jungle Book. And suddenly in the Eumenides, it was like, it wasn't a show for kids. And there were all of these things that were really pressing for me intellectually anyway. And I could take that with the kind of seriousness that you brought to the content. So I was thinking about, you know, bloodlines and the umbilical cord and our interconnectivity as human beings, and I was thinking about, like, you know, rhizomes and root systems and things like that.
What you gave me in terms of your jumping off points and the springboards and just the way that your mind worked when you were going through this process.
It was so inspiring. The conversations we
really
had.
Interesting.
The way Sebastian thinks about these projects and the way she visualizes them, and it's almost as if they come from some internal wellspring of, you know, just intense creativity. So it was very inspiring for me to have this kind of conversation about design and the visual dimension of this story, of story and character, in a way that was actually quite new to me. So she inspired me quite a bit.
You inspired her too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it was really so great to be able to have the depth of conversation around the content, and also to be freed from the story and really deal entirely in metaphor and object. And I wanted to say, one of the things for me that was new was working in a space that size. And so in the museum, I mean, I've done a lot of work in museum spaces, responding specifically to the content of the museum, but this was really about responding to the architecture of the museum. And initially we thought about doing a lot of shadow work and kind of casting images of the sculpture. But this story wasn't really about those sculptures, and so we had to think about how to occupy that space with these objects that are unbelievably powerful. So I had to make a decision about, you know, I wasn't going to create props, and I wasn't going to create puppets. So I had to think about, I don't really make, I mean, I hadn't dealt in costume before, but I thought but I do make objects that move, which is what costumes are. So I thought, how do I make the performers have any weight in this incredible space? So it has to be like opera. You know, it has to be like outrageously gigantic costume, because nothing else is going to compete with the Chinese dog and the you know, the
Ramses too.
The Ramses too, and you know, how do you occupy space? So that was I mean, one of the reasons I made those really giant shoes was partly because I wear them, but also because I had to elevate those gods. And so, and I was, you know, so anyway, I'd been working with paper for a long time, but it had been fairly literal, and it was exciting to think in these more abstract, metaphoric ways. And then, you know, so I thought about the bleeding, like the sadness and the bleeding of Clytemnestra, and how that could sort of be part of everything. And then it was kind of interesting in that the things that we ended up making costume-wise also influenced the movement, because I decided I had been doing a lot of work with crumpled paper, white paper, and illuminating it in other projects, mostly as an environmental component. So it seemed wonderful to make these kind of cloud-like costumes for these like white gods, you know? And then I wanted them to be taller because they were gods, and so I made these giant platform shoes, but they were dangerous to walk in them normally. So we put felt on the bottom and they had to slide, which made them kind of like chess pieces because they couldn't, you know, it's kind of like the king on a chessboard is really limited in his movement. And I kind of liked the fact that these costumes and those shoes made them in a kind of awkward. And I thought, like, that's good because those gods aren't going to be there forever just like that, because the Furies are going to come back and knock them down.
They've got all the movement.
One of the moments I'd like to revisit is the moment when Sebastian brought in just skeins of paper with the actors we had these workshops for improvisatory workshops, and she led the actors in these improvisations with paper, which was so thrilling to me. And what we discovered is the sound of the paper became a real component of what we wound up doing with the character and with the movement and its relationship with the acoustics, and the paper became this medium, not just also definitely the costumes of Apollo and Athena with their height and their illuminations and their whipped cream looking costumes. Then we had the Furies emanating from the earth with these, and we thought very differently about the crust, almost the crust of the earth, and they're kind of breaking through this crusty, and their movements with the paper became something quite different. It was really exciting to watch that come alive.
One of my favorite moments in training the Furies was to have these young women performers under this paper and having them saying to them, like, don't wrap that paper around you like a cape that you're cowering. When you're underground and nobody can see you, figure out how to take advantage of that. Figure out how to sneak up underneath the earth and come out fierce. Don't let us know where you're coming from. And just like working with these like 18, 19, 20-year-old women and saying, like, use your hiding to your benefit, and when you come out, bite our heads off. You know, like,
that's cool.
You know, that was also like part of how
the actors really they responded in really interesting ways.
So what is next for you? We only have a minute or so.
Sorry, I thought we had so much more time.
Well, God, this conversation's been so great, and just learning from you, it's amazing.
2 hours, sorry.
So what's up next? What are you guys going to collaborate on now? Because I know this is not going away, this collaboration.
No, it's not going away. We definitely plan to do something for 2018 Fringe Festival.
Awesome.
And we're hoping to move our interests into joining a sort of interest in climate change and the planet.
Nice.
With our sort of fierce artistry around storytelling.
Yeah.
So maybe you could say a little bit more about, Sebastian's been working quite a bit on a project that I've been hearing a lot about. I've been working on some ideas in tandem that we're sort of in the process of, through discussion, braiding together.
And this is the Penn program for environmental.
I was until recently on the board of the Penn program for environmental humanities. And I've been very inspired by that program at the university, and their work is basically that of it's interdisciplinary, joining disciplines together, and getting people from chemistry and physics to talk to people in the arts, for example, across divides to discuss how we're going to solve these interminable problems with our globe. And I've been very inspired by a lot of the work that I've seen in conferences and conversations I've heard in a sort of more academic context. And my desire is to leverage that and bring it into a theatrical world.
That's very
with
exciting.
Sebastian. And maybe you could talk about your Worth project.
So we've just been talking about, we've talked about the environmental question really since the Eumenides. And,
yes, we have.
And even we could just revisit the Furies probably and make something, seriously. I've been thinking about economics for about 5 years, maybe longer, and I know we have really limited time now, so I'm trying to think about how to do this in 3 sentences. I've developed a proposal called Worth, the Currency Project, to look at the relationship between kind of the dominant language around economics and non-numerical systems of exchange. I actually saw We Shall Not Be Moved last night at the Wilma, and it opens with this idea that I felt sort of encapsulated things so well. It starts out by saying John Africa was a radical believer in the green movement.
Right.
And then it talks and then this contemporary family says, this contemporary black family says, family of orphans, says, we can't possibly win in this system at large. And so we're going to separate ourselves and have our own family, and we know we have value. And then the whole thing is sort of like it's this fictional group, and it's also referencing the Africa family. And for me, that idea that there's systems of value that are not part of dominant culture that we have to be able to, whose value we have to be able to articulate and elevate, and partly understanding how to talk about it in economic terms and kind of make that language interchangeable is at the essence of change. And so, as artists, we already live in a value system that's not part of the dominant culture, and we have to think about that. And I think there are ways to think about environmental questions in that way too.
That's great. And the green grid and what was it, the green grid, the metaphor that you came up with?
A long time ago, not a long time ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I started I did a project for the Historical Society, and I was looking at William Penn and utopias, and I was interested in this question of the black cog in the green grid, that when you have a utopian idea, that actually there are still ways in which you're reliant on things outside of, what's inside your little grid of idealism, whether it's slavery or oil or, when we have our local farm to table urban gardens, like how self-sufficient are those things really, and what's underneath it that's connected to a larger system. So those are questions that are interesting.
That's really cool, guys. I'm so glad that you came here today. You're both so immensely talented and
Thank
really,
you.
Just brilliant and creative and inspiring, and I know that our audience is going to love your work and want to see more of it. So thank you both for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Show, of course.
I think your show is amazing.
Well,
and such a contribution.
So cool to be able to have an opportunity
to talk about this stuff.
I'm just really excited that I get to meet both of you, and I'm inspired by you. I'm hoping that I can, if I'm producing something, hire you at some point.
Yay.
Honestly,
open for that.
I do a little bit of theater production on the side. So thank you again. And please, everyone, check out Marcia and Sebastian's beautiful work. And also Theater Company's website, www.whiteboxtheater.com. It should be at the bottom of the screen. And we hope that you'll join us next time for the Philadelphia Cultural Forum on CCP TV, Community College of Philadelphia's Emmy Award-nominated educational channel. I'm your host, Kirsten Quinn. Good night, everyone.